It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bryan Sexton as the next speaker. Dr. Sexton is the director of the Duke Patient Safety Center. Bryan is a psychologist by training, and he'll be talking to us today about resiliency and the prevalence and severity of burnout in healthcare. Bryan?
Well, thank you, Johan, and thank you, everyone, for joining the call today. It's pretty difficult to justify coming together during your very busy day to learn about how busy you are and how that can have negative effects on your work and your personal life. But that's what we're going to do. So I want to just open up this part of the presentation by saying I'm going to present you with some information that's very current about the state of kind of emotional exhaustion in healthcare. It's a little bit of a bummer. It's a little bit of a downer to learn about this. And so we're going to end the webinar with a tool that is really extraordinary. Imagine, if you will, the ability to have an aerosolized version of Prozac or some other SSRI for your staff. Right, so you just walk around and everybody's just a little bit less grumpy and cranky all the time. So to get there, though, we have to understand the need for going over something like this. And so I'd like to share with you a brief story, if I can. And this goes back to work that we've done in patient safety, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, where we showed in ICUs that you can reduce bloodstream infections, and it's very exciting, and it's, these relatively straightforward things that you can do, like have a line cart for central lines and use full barrier precautions, and things like wash your hands, things that seem like, yeah, we've heard that already. And yet, when we look at the 66% reduction of bloodstream infections in the state of Michigan after that project, there was about 1 out of 5 of those ICUs that did not improve. So we got to 66% reduction in the state, but 1 out of 5 ICUs didn't get better. Now, we replicated that with the Robert Wood Johnson project, where we found that we could reduce bloodstream infections. In fact, that we could actually reduce bloodstream infections by 81%. That was very exciting. In fact, we had a big face-to-face meeting to celebrate just how wonderful our clinical improvements were in a follow-up project to the Keystone ICU. However, and for those of you who've been working in the NICU for a while, this might sound familiar. Right after a big face-to-face celebration, we did this in Orlando. We had all the physician champions brought in, the nurse managers, the team leads. You know these people. You've been working with them in your own work in the NICU. Well, after we congratulated ourselves on this massive reduction in bloodstream infections, I was literally attacked in the hallway by some very angry nurse managers and other kind of research nurses who literally said, "What now? We fixed your bloodstream infection problem, but now to do that, we had to come in early, we had to stay late, we had to skip meals, we used up our favors that our friends owed us, and now we're broken. So what are you going to do about that, Dr. Sexton? What are you going to do about that?" And that is at the crux of what we're going to be talking about today. We have a tendency in healthcare. Every time we succeed at something, we move the goalposts further down the field so that the new level of success has to be significantly higher than the outstanding level of achievement that we've already achieved. And this is part of what's burning us out. So rather than just jump from bloodstream infections to ventilator-associated pneumonia rates to chronic lung disease to palliative care, whatever the case may be, it's always one more mission impossible. And what we need to do is understand that in order to be ready to do quality in the long term, we have to build capacity in our staff now. And that capacity building is something that few hospitals are ready to do, especially when we're in a resource-restricted environment. So with that in mind, I would like to suggest, if I could, going to take you to a website called despair.com. So www.despair.com, where you can get anti-motivational posters like this one. Quality. The race for quality has no finish line, so technically it's more like a death march. This is what we're doing in healthcare. We have set the bar so high for so long that we're really pooped, to be quite frank. And this has effects on our work-life balance and on our self-care, but it also has effects on our sleep quality, and once we compromise our sleep quality, all bets are off for our personal lives, you name it. We start saying and doing things that we shouldn't. So I'd like to argue that in order to really achieve the best possible care, we have to back off of patient-centered this and patient-centered that. I know that sounds controversial, but hear me out. Patient-centered care, for the sake of patient-centered care, completely misses the point that no one's looking out for the care and feeding of healthcare workers. No one is making the resilience of our healthcare workers a priority, and that's outrageous, frankly, because you cannot deliver patient-centered care in the long term at the expense of current healthcare worker resilience and wherewithal and resolve. So really, to redefine quality, we have to take better care of ourselves. Once we're taking better care of ourselves, we can take better care of each other. And then on top of that, we can ultimately have sustainable patient-centered care. Patient-centered care is still the goal. We just shouldn't jump into it without recognizing the consequences that has for kind of our wherewithal. So I'd like to argue, if I could, about the most important organ in all of this, discussion of resilience, and give you a definition, really, for resilience. So you can go to Michael Unger's cross-cultural definition of resilience. It's pretty technical, to be frank. I like to say, in other words, so in other words, your resilience is a function of your ability to cope and the availability of resources related to health and well-being. Your resilience is 30% your genes and the way you were raised. The other 70% comes from the access that you have and the availability of resources related to your health and well-being. That could be opportunities and windows to sleep, to exercise, to call a friend, to spend time with your loved ones, right? What do we do at a staff meeting? Do we serve Krispy Kreme donuts, or is it a fruit platter? And these are simple things. They seem like they're not a big deal, but in the long term, after decades and decades, they're quite important indeed. So your resilience is a function of your ability to cope. Now, we can't do anything about your genes. At least we can't do anything about that yet. But we can do something about our access to resources related to health and well-being. So at the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you a very straightforward tool. It's not an old tool. It's a relatively new tool, but it's very powerful. It's not significantly different from Prozac, and it has something. It only takes you a few minutes each night for 2 weeks to get the benefits of Prozac for 6 to 9 months. So if you think that you would be willing to kind of do something for 2 to 5 minutes each night for 2 weeks in order to get the functionality of Prozac, and that the rest of your staff in your unit would be effectively taking Prozac as well, then buckle up, because I think you might be interested in what we cover at the end of this presentation. So this brings us to the concept of what organ, right? Now that we've defined resilience, what organ is most responsible for resilience? Well, I have to say, if you look at the one that resides between your ears, it's the one that we pay attention to the least when it comes to our resilience. And this part in particular at the front that's behind your forehead, the prefrontal cortex, plays the biggest role, really, in our resilience. The brain is 2% of our body weight. It's 20 to 30% of our oxygen, our calories, our blood flow goes to the brain. In particular, goes to that prefrontal cortex. It's hugely important in terms of how we function, and yet this one part in particular, the prefrontal cortex, is just so ignored. Unfortunately, it's that prefrontal cortex that gives us our ability to regulate our emotions and have socially appropriate and emotionally appropriate interactions. As you look around the room that you're sitting in, do you know anyone from your unit who might be socially or emotionally inappropriate? You just think to yourself, that person, they have a prefrontal problem. That's their filter that kind of really allows them to be socially and emotionally appropriate. So it's from prefrontal cortex that we get our ability to focus, to have empathy and sympathy, to have foresight, to have good planning, good organization, to learn from our mistakes. Is very relevant for the learning from defects tool, to be insightful, to make good decisions. All of this comes from that executive command center, the prefrontal cortex, that front part of the brain. Now, I'll ask you, and I would like you to be honest. Everyone be as honest as you can, please. As you look at your past week, raise your hand. I know that not everybody can see this, but raise your hand if you have skipped a meal at some point in the past 7 days. Anybody skipped a meal? Raise your hand. All right. Now, anybody who has gotten home late from work in the past week, raise your hand if you've gotten home late from work. All right, there you go. Put your hand down. Now, in the past week, did you get a poor night's sleep at any point in the last week? Raise your hand. Okay, put your hand down. And then if you have felt stressed at any point in the last week, raise your hand. All right, I got one more for you. If you deliberately limited your fluid intake so you didn't have to pee during your shifts, raise your hand. And now what I'd like to explain to you is all of those things that we do on a regular basis. Now, I just described for you maybe a typical Thursday, but what that is, in fact, all of those things restrict your blood flow and therefore the oxygen that makes it to your prefrontal cortex in particular. So if you're feeling stressed, you get vasoconstriction to the prefrontal cortex. If you don't drink enough water, you get vasoconstriction. If you finally do drink fluid and it happens to be coffee, caffeine causes vasoconstriction. If you're feeling stressed, if you skip a meal, if you don't get a night's sleep, vasoconstriction in the extreme. At this point, you're so stupid you don't even know you're stupid. Welcome to modern-day healthcare. This is where we are systematically kind of attacking our ability to be, sympathetic to ourselves and to others, to be organized, to make good decisions, to have good planning behaviors, to learn from our mistakes. That's all prefrontal, and that all suffers basically when we're under stress. So, but wait, there's more. If we look at just the past. Well, actually, let me finish that point here. The prefrontal cortex is busier in women than it is in men. And so if I were to read to you a transcript that said, honey, pull over. I'm fine. I know what I'm doing. No, you don't. Pull over and ask someone. I'm fine. I know what I'm doing. You can probably tell which gender is which in that, and it's because women do a better job of this than us silly boys. If we go back over the past 20 years, our productivity has shot up over 20%. Our wages, adjusted for inflation, are down almost 20%, 19.6%. And this is important. So we're working harder than ever before. We're earning less money. So this is very difficult for someone in a leadership role today to say, well, back in my day, people didn't complain about having to work on Fridays and stay beyond the end of their shift. Well, this is not back in your day anymore. There is no more kind of back in your day. That's long gone now. Our ability to make well-informed decisions is remarkably better now. Yeah, right. 20 years ago, you had to look something up in a library. Today, there's an app for that, right? Well, that might seem like it's good, but that information fatigue has an impact on our ability to make good decisions. Let me explain to you why. As our stress levels have gone up and our access to information has gone up, one of the unintended consequences of that is that even when you have more information at your fingertips and you can sift through the information more quickly, we have begun to sacrifice the accuracy of the information that we're looking for the speed and the immediacy with which we can receive that information. So in other words, if you look something up in Google and you get a response in 0.013 seconds, you think, wow, I sure got that information fast. It wasn't what I was looking for, but I sure did get it fast. And that's really a metaphor for what's happening today in the NICU. It's happening in healthcare in general. We're hearing more and more it's more important to be a fast nurse than to be a good nurse, and that has consequences too. That's just in the past 20 years. Let's look just in the past 10 years. In the past 10 years, one of the unintended consequences of smartphones is that even though we can get access to information more quickly, and even if, despite being tired and distracted and kind of multitasking all the time, even if you're able to make the objectively right decision, you're not as happy about it because you made the decision under duress. So 20 years ago, you'd make the right decision in a pinch, and it would feel prideful. It would feel like, this is why I'm here. I made a difference today. I feel like I'm making a difference. Today, you don't feel like you're making a difference because you're doing everything under duress, under time pressure, with all kinds of production pressures from all sides. That has a consequence for our resilience as well. Now, some wonderful researchers at Temple University have provided a suggestion for this, and I'm not saying that this suggestion works for everybody, but just think about it for a second. Why not create for yourself an island of isolation once a day for 30 minutes? Let me explain to you why. 10 years ago, if we were to randomly survey you and you happen to be multitasking, what are you doing? I'm on a conference call. Oh, really? So if you're on a conference call, what does that mean you're doing? That means you're checking your email while you're on a conference call, and you're probably texting someone some new information. So you've got all these inputs and outputs, and you're doing it all at the same time. In 2001, can you believe it? I can get my email on my cell phone. This is pretty cool. That was 2001. In 2011, it's, oh, for the love of God, I wish that I could just do one thing at a time. Multitasking in 10 short years went from being exciting and thrilling to being frustrating and really the bane of our existence. People say, well, I see you've got your BlackBerry right there in front of you. I emailed you 18 minutes ago. Why didn't you respond? That's the expectation that comes together with the improvements in technology, improvements in air quotes. Now, with that in mind, if you can turn it off for 30 minutes, up to 90 is great, right? But if you can just find 30 minutes a day where you can do one thing at a time, what this research from Temple University has shown us is that you can rebuild some of your prefrontal reserves that are being depleted because you're available and accessible to too many people too often. You've got your Facebook, and you've got your Twitter, and you've got your texts, and you've got your email, and you've got your cell phone. People can call you all the time. Being accessible to everyone else all the time depletes you because you're not having face-to-face meaningful interactions. You're on Facebook saying silly things like, hey, I'm on my front porch drinking some tea and my cat just farted. Yep. That's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything, but this is the nature of our digital age, and we're not drawn to meaningful interactions. What's left are these kind of, the image we want to portray through Facebook, or the image that we want to portray through some kind of snappy, snazzy text message or tweet or whatever. Now, that has consequences, and so if you can have 30 minutes a day where you're just doing one thing, maybe you're just charting, maybe you're just eating a sandwich, maybe you're just doing one thing a day, then you go through the rest of your day. Preferably if you can have your island of isolation for prefrontal restoration. If you can have that for, it doesn't mean you're not working. It means that you're just doing one thing. If you can do that around midday, it tends to be best. You get the best benefit for that. So that's one thing to consider, but that's not the tool that we're talking about. We're going to lead up to a really cool tool at the end of the presentation here. So really where we're going with this is in our Resilience Collaborative that we do, that Jochen and I have done together, that we're doing at the Patient Safety Center, we have these 5 pillars of resilience, and today we're going to talk about self-awareness. We're going to try to help you to understand just how prevalent and extensive some of these issues around burnout are. So to get there, we're going to cover just the self-awareness pillar today, but we also have a mindfulness pillar, and the content on that we covered in our previous webinar. We have a purpose pillar, purpose and meaning. We have a self-care and fatigue management and stress management pillar, and then we have a relationships pillar. And believe me, the relationship between your interpersonal interactions and your immune system function, it continues to blow me away, all the findings that come out just on a weekly basis here in the literature. So here are a couple of quotes for you. Quality improvement is lonely. You don't make a lot of friends walking around telling people what they could be doing better. Number 2, healthcare has become over-reliant on shaming people and threatening them to get them to do more. My goodness, come in early, stay late, get it done. All this finger-wagging is no longer an effective motivation and incentive for well-intentioned, busy healthcare workers. And then finally, your resilience will only be reliably protected and enhanced by what you do. Every system that we work in is fundamentally designed to drain us, our resilience, not to protect us. So we'll kind of go through what we mean by that. Here's another despair.com anti-motivational poster. Burnout attitudes are contagious, and mine might kill you. Just to give you a brief demonstration, we are finding, and this is something that Jochen Profit and I have found in our NICU research as well, is that burnout is not just an individual phenomenon, it is a group-level phenomenon. It acts as a kind of a culture, and you have NICUs that vary systematically on the extent to which there's burnout. And if burnout wasn't a group-level construct, you'd see the same kind of distribution across all the NICUs, but we see wild variability between NICUs on burnout. And when NICUs have a lot of burnout in them, our ability to do quality improvement in the long term is compromised. You might try to launch a project, but you're not going to finish it if you've got a lot of burnout in your unit. So to give you an example of this, I'll show you some research. This is actually by my wife. That's not me, Sexton. That's my wife, where she showed using Johns Hopkins ICUs that half of the critical care nurses there were met the criteria for emotional exhaustion for burnout syndrome, half. 2 out of 3 of them had difficulty sleeping, and 1 out of 4 were clinically depressed. This is scary stuff because when you think about it, depression's like between, at 6%, 8% of the population. Kind of technically in 2012, it's creeping up to 9%. But generally accepted, between 6 and 8% of the population are clinically depressed. The fact that it's 1 out of 4 nurses is really creepy because it's getting that bad. So what I'd like everyone to do, whether you're in Monterey or you're in Houston, is we're going to play the burnout game. And in order to do this, you're going to have to stand up. So wherever you are, please stand up because we're going to take the burnout quiz. And I'm going to wager that I can get everyone, and Jochen, if you can be ready to kind of unmute the phone in a second, I want to ask you if we succeeded in getting everybody to sit down. So if you will all rise, it's just like church, all rise. Because our goal here is to review with you the 7 hallmarks of burnout in the general population. And once we've gone through that, my hope is that you will see just how prevalent burnout is. As I go through each of the bullet points, if you see one of the hallmarks of burnout and you're like, oh my gosh, that's me, all I ask you to do is have a seat, sit down. So if I read to you a hallmark and it resonates with you, find your chair. And my promise to you is that every one of you in Mexico and every one of you there in Houston are going to be on your butts within about 3 minutes. So if you will just listen carefully, and if it's relevant to you, have a seat. Number 1. This is kind of like Jeff Foxworthy. I don't know if you're familiar with the American comedian Jeff Foxworthy. He says, you just might be a redneck if you mow your lawn and you find your car. Right, that guy. So you just might be burned out if you try to be everything to everyone. If you try to be everything to everyone, go ahead and find your chair, have a seat. Don't worry. If you're iffy, stay standing because you're all going to go down. You're all going to go down. Number 10. Oh, and I can tell you right now, those of you who are still standing, there's like a quarter of you who really wanted to sit down, but you want to see what else is going to happen. That's all right. You're all going down, I promise you. Number 2, you just might be burned out if you get to the end of a hard day of work and you feel like you've not made a meaningful difference. If that's you, have a seat, and if you'd like to reemphasize the point, you were already seated, you can stand up and sit back down. Number 3, you just might be burned out if you feel like the work you're doing is not recognized. You feel like the work you're doing is not recognized. You lose a lot of people on that. Number 4, you just might be burned out if you identify so strongly with work that you lack a reasonable balance between work and your personal life.
That was the killer?
Number 4, yes. Here's number 5, you just might be burned out if your job varies between monotony and chaos. If that's you, find your chair. Number just might be burned out if you feel you have little or no control over your work. And before we go to number 7, Jochen, about what % of the room is still standing?
About 3 to 4%, maybe.
About 3 to 4%. All right. Well, then the last indicator. These are the hallmarks of burnout in the general population. The 7th one is from the general population. You just might be burned out if you work in healthcare. So hopefully everyone's seated now. You understand the prevalence of burnout is extreme, and you are uniquely vulnerable to burnout in healthcare just because of the way healthcare is set up. You have to make yourself psychologically, intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally available to others when they're at a weak point in their lives. And that is a very draining experience, especially when we make it less about face-to-face interactions and more about kind of yourself to electron interactions. And the further away we get from patients, the less rewarding in many ways caregiving becomes. This is something that we have to kind of address as we make the shift towards more technology in healthcare. But let's go through. Now you understand how prevalent it is in others. I'd like to give you a quick demonstration of what it looks like as you go through the stages of burnout in healthcare. The first is rumination. So if you're stuck in this broken record, just saying the same thing again and again, it's one of these negative loops that you might catch yourself in. Oh my goodness, 20-time overdose on this little neonate, 20-time overdose on this little neonate. What was I thinking? I can't believe I did that. It was a 20-time overdose on this tiny little baby. What am I doing? You hear what that is? That's rumination. You're just saying the same thing again and again. You're not saying what I learned from this was. You're not saying this will make me a better nurse because, or this will make me a better physician because, or this will make me a better leader having gone through this, or so this is what it's like. I better pay attention so I'll be able to give support to my colleagues when this eventually happens to them. No, you're not making meaning from it. You're beating yourself up about it. And that lack of self-compassion, you can do that for a while, but it comes at a cost. Now, at this point, when you're in rumination, right after an event, right here is where if someone draws attention to it, if someone grabs your elbow and says, friend, you're in a negative loop. Shut up. Stop that. If you're going to talk about it, put some meaning into it. What I'm going to learn from this is this happened because I'm going to be a better person through this, eventually through, fill in the blank, fill in the blank. But if you're going to sit there and just be in a negative loop, nobody wants to hear that. You don't want to hear it. You're hurting yourself, and you're bumming everybody out, so stop that. Right? Now, if you do that to a friend, you just saved them a bundle on therapy. Because that's really, if you don't address it at this point, it starts to get into a position where you really need to have someone who's got some professional expertise behind helping it. But at the rumination phase, it can be interrupted by just a colleague who recognizes, oh, here's my buddy who's in a negative loop. If you don't address it at that stage, you go into burnout, physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion. This is where it takes effort to put one foot in front of the other to make your way back into the NICU. Right? You park your car, you take your key out of the ignition, and you think, I cannot believe I'm going to walk all the way back into the NICU today. What am I doing? That's physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion. You can continue to beat yourself up at this point. The rumination might still be there. I can't, 20-time overdose for that little girl. What does that say about me as a nurse? What does that say about me as a mother? What does that say about me as a whatever your identity is now compromised? Whatever identities you had, they're now being threatened. You have this imposter syndrome. What does it say about me as a, and then you realize, oh my goodness, am I the last person in the world to realize what an idiot I am? I wonder how many other mistakes I've made and didn't even know it. Everybody must know I'm an idiot but me. Oh my goodness, is this the right profession for me? It all goes through that cynicism, up to that cynicism stage. And if you continue to beat yourself up without any meaning making, without drawing any message from it, you're just beating yourself up, you slip from shame and doubt into cynicism and negativity. And this is what many people think of as burnout. Oh, look, they're just burned out. They're so negative about everything. And when you go to that stage, you're still thinking 20-time overdose for that little girl. What was I thinking? I'm such an idiot. But you don't follow it up with, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. You follow it up with, oh, to hell with it. I don't even care. Look, I'm going to miss this meeting. I'm like next up on the agenda. My slot comes up in 7 minutes. I'm still 40 minutes away from the medical center. I'll never make it on time. Out of hell with it. I don't even care. I don't even care. Doesn't matter. I don't like this job anyway, and my kids are weird, and my car smells funny. Out of hell with everything. And that's kind of how it kind of progresses into that negative spiral. Now, you can continue to beat yourself up and say 20-time overdose, what was I thinking? But at this point, you're making your way into clinical depression. And if it's an event-triggered thing like a medical error or a sentinel event and there's harm involved in particular, this can lead to PTSD, and this is serious. At this point, you really wish that someone had grabbed your elbow. Think of the money and the time and energy and desperation you can prevent if you just stop a colleague when they're in the rumination phase, when they're in that negative loop, broken record phase. Stop them, help them, tell them that they're in a negative loop and they have to stop that, and that they can talk to you about it or they can talk to somebody else about it. But if they just can't continue down that negative loop, it's a really bad journey that they're on. So with that, we've now talked about really the prevalence of burnout in the room that you're sitting in. Let's look at the prevalence of burnout kind of out there. Not just are you burned out, but are they burned out? So here's a quick tour of the literature. Assessing burnout in neonatologists, we see that 30% of neonatologists met the criteria for high burnout. Here we have it in home health and hospice nurses. 40% of them met the criteria for severe emotional exhaustion. In JAMA, it was published recently that 30 to 40% of physicians in the United States meet the criteria for burnout. These are studies by Derby and Schanfeld. And Schanfeld and Derby are both from Mayo. They do a lot of really wonderful research on burnout, so we've got a lot of citations from them. The Martini study in residents showed that back in 2004, it's worse now than it was in 2004, but back in 2004, 50%, 49% of residents, by the time they finish their residency, meet the criteria for burnout, and it ranges by specialty from 27% to 75%. So to look at that in particular, obstetrics have it the worst, 75%, yikes. Versus family medicine, where it's only 27% of them met the criteria for burnout by the time they finished their training. Here we have career fit amongst academic faculty, same thing, 34% of them met the criteria for burnout. We can look at burnout in academic medicine, and we'll see also that in nurses, in very large studies, it's about 1 out of 3, 33% here in Linda Aiken's study of burnout across those 9 countries, but in another study she did of 12 countries in Europe and the United States, it came out to be 34%. So it's about 1 out of 3. That's what you heard Jochen say at the beginning of this webinar. You look left, you look right, you look in a mirror, one of those 3 people are likely to be not just burned out, but severely burned out. That's pretty scary stuff. Here in JAMA, we see that hospital nurse staffing, patient mortality, burnout, and job dissatisfaction all go hand in hand. In fact, hospitals that had higher nurse-to-patient ratios had surgical patients experience higher risk-adjusted 30-day mortality and failure to rescue rates, and nurses are more likely there to experience burnout and job dissatisfaction. I know I'm going through this data quickly. It's just to kind of underscore the point. We have also, some people say, what role does race and ethnicity play? Well, we found that if you are non-white and non-male, you have put up with some really ridiculously bigoted and strange people in your life, and you tend to have a thicker skin. It's not a huge effect, but if you are a kind of quote-unquote minority status, you tend to fare better with your burnout situation and emotional exhaustion than your kind of white male counterparts, for example. This is using the United States as the base sample for that. So it's not a huge effect, but it's a consistent effect across studies. When we look at years of training, with each additional year of training, what you see in this little figure here on the right is that with each additional year of training, your emotional exhaustion increases, and usually it increases significantly. So wherever your burnout rate was when you started, it gets worse by the time you're done. Linking burnout to depression, depressed residents made 6 times as many medication errors as non-depressed residents, and when we see rates like this, it's very scary. In these nurses, they actually found PTSD rates as high as 18%. PTSD at 18% is approaching combat veteran levels of PTSD, which is about 24 to 27%. So that's kind of scary that being a nurse is equivalent to being shot at and blown up at work every day. But this is where it's going if we don't pay more attention to it, because it can be very. And you see what I meant at the beginning of the presentation when I said this can be a little bit of a bummer to look at some of this. I want to cheer you up before we're done, so don't worry. Patterns of distress in U.S. medical students, this is scary stuff. We have 50% of these medical students that already meet the criteria of burnout. This is in 2000. Well, the study is actually from 2011, but we're talking here 50%. Not only that, if we look at the people who meet the criteria for excessive fatigue, that's 46% of these medical students meet the criteria for sleep apnea, just through their fatigue symptoms alone. In fact, what Derby has shown is that 50% of medical students meet the criteria for burnout, and 10% have already contemplated harming themselves. 10%. That's what we mean when we say yikes. So there's work-home conflict and burnout amongst internal medicine physicians. This is an interesting one where they found that both in surgeons and in internal medicine physicians, in two very different studies, they found the same 3 factors that predicted burnout. Hours worked per week, having had work and home conflict within the past 3 weeks, and if you did have the conflict, resolving that last work-home conflict in favor of work. All of those things were what predicted burnout in those two disparate samples, helping you to understand where some of it comes from. So the good news is, all of you that are now participating in this CUSP 2.0 project, is that there are some protective factors. One of them is research participation, teehee. If you are participating in research, involved in research, you think about how the work that you're doing can be learned from and shed light on other people in your role, and that can kind of create some purpose and meaning in what you do that goes beyond your immediate kind of clinical care responsibilities, where you can drive a sense of purpose and meaning. So there's a protective factor when you're involved in research. Sometimes Jochen and I have calls where we're not quite sure that it applies to us. Better palliative care, but numbers of decisions to forego life-sustaining treatments in the last week. Age. With age comes wisdom. One of the few things that really changes about your intelligence as you get older is your emotional intelligence. You get better at making tricky decisions, kind of linearly with age. Your ability to choose days off is associated with burnout, and quality of your working relationships, patients, managers, working with the physicians, working with the other colleagues, etc. So where this kind of takes us now is into the realm of propaganda. So it's not enough to just put up a poster that says, cheer up, patient safety starts with me, yeehaw, we're the best, center of the universe for everything. That kind of tends to make people angry when they see it. And you might say to yourself, well, this stuff that Jochen and Bryan are talking about, that doesn't really apply to me. All I need is a vacation. I bet you do need a vacation. You probably need a vacation. But what we find is that for a vacation, defined in the literature as 7 to 10 days, and who does that anymore? A minority of us actually continue to take 7 to 10 day vacations. We have a 3-day weekend and we think, oh, vacation. Or you think that what you're doing for Thanksgiving is a vacation. Ladies and gentlemen, that trip that you take to go visit those weird relatives that you have, that is not a vacation. If you're not walking on the beach without your crackberry and no responsibilities whatsoever, it's not a vacation. Having obligations to visit your weird relatives and kind of conjure up all that family of origin stuff that makes those dinners awkward at times, that weird uncle who you want to keep your kids away from, whatever the case may be, those are not vacations, those are trips, and we have to be careful about confusing trips with vacations. They mean different things empirically. You might feel relief if you're taking 7 to 10 days off by day 3 of your vacation, but that only lasts 2 to 3 weeks, and by the time you come back and you've been back for a month, there's no more residual impact of your vacation. It's gone it's gone by week 3, the impact of that reprieve that you feel. So it's not just a vacation. We need something more than that. In fact, if we look at what George Lucas told us with Yoda, you remember Yoda? Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. This is really the right idea. With the more stress that you have leads to frustration, that leads to anger, which leads to that suspicion and mistrust and that imposter syndrome, and ultimately that leads to the cynicism and negativity. And then after that point, we need some professional help and some meds. Well, those of us who work hard and expect our system to work, that we expect our colleagues to do what they say they're going to do, we expect the best for our patients, we're the most vulnerable to burnout. That's the bad news. Burnout and laziness are often conflated. Listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. If you are lazy, you have found the magical kryptonite that will forever protect you from burnout, because people who are lazy don't try hard enough to get burned out. It is not the same thing. In fact, when you have the tenacity and temerity to expect everything to work, and you really bust your butt to get things done, and it still doesn't work, that's what gets you burned out. So the lead weights that make it worse are work hours, working nights, having conflicts with colleagues, fiscal debt, poor boundaries between work and home life are the things that make it worse. The things that can prevent it from being as bad as it could be: spending time with a loved one, having good social support, having a positive learning environment, having a clinician as a parent. So if you've got a mom or a dad who's a clinician, good for you. And if you don't, too bad. If you are a parent, listen, if you think you're burned out now, go pop out a couple more kids and see how you feel. Being a parent is associated with burnout as well. Getting satisfaction from conversations with others. You ever met one of those chatty people that says, oh, yeah, during these resuscitations that we've looked at, these neonatal resuscitations, it's amazing to me how sometimes a transplant nurse will wander in and is saying stuff like, "Oh, look at you. We like it when your name's in pink, and look, you don't have any genetic abnormalities whatsoever. And oh, look, you don't need any blow-by. Look at you. Look at you." And by talking that baby talk and just being one of these people that likes to hear their own voice, having that presence in the team actually makes the resuscitation more effective, because all of that background kind of narration keeps everyone informed as to the status of the baby and what's going on. That's an interesting one there. But also just people who like to have conversations with others. Do you get into a taxi cab and start chatting it up with the taxi cab driver? Those are the types of people who tend to fare better with challenging and adverse situations. Having control over your days off is another factor, and also having good quality working relationships. So with all this in mind, this kind of brings us to the tool that I wanted to share with you, and the tool is called 3 Good Things. Now, this is because we are hardwired as human beings to remember the negative. You have a bad day at work, we remember the negative stuff. There's a reason for that. In fact, if we look at the data, it's pretty compelling. On sleep deprivation and what we remember, it's in terms of our memories, it's really compelling. If we take a busy neonatal nurse and we deprive him or her of sleep for one night, so you're up for 35 hours, right? Up all day, up all night, up all day the next day. Now at the end of your shift on day 2, your ability to remember stuff from the first day, having not slept in between day 1 and day 2, is reduced by 40%. So 40% reduction in our ability to form new memories. But wait, if you look at the type of memory, that plays a role in whether or not you remember it. Positive memories have an over 50% reduction in our ability to retain them with a night of sleep deprivation. Neutral memories, almost 40%. But negative memories, some of these are nasty and rude and mean and cruel and unusual to you. You work in one of those festering cesspools, you're going to remember all the details of all those interactions, because it sticks to you. That NS is for not statistically significant if it's a negative memory, right? So you're distracted, you're tired, you're overloaded, but you still remember all the bad stuff, and it's hard to remember the good stuff. The good stuff slips away. Why is that? Because we're hardwired to remember the negative. Think about that for a second. How many of you have a difficult time remembering good jokes over the course of your life? It's tricky. Why? Because there's no biological or evolutionary reason that you would remember good jokes, because that's a positive thing, and it's not going to save your butt if it takes up room in your brain. However, if you've ever heard a rattlesnake rattle, and for those of you in Mexico and in Texas, I would imagine many of you have heard a rattlesnake rattle. You'll never forget that. You'll be in your late 80s, full-bore dementia, and you'll hear, you'll think, oh, snap, that's not good, right? You won't remember the names of your children, but you'll think, oh, man, that sounds bad. Partly because the negative stuff can save your butt, and that's why it takes up all that extra room in your brain. We're hardwired to remember the negative. Think about this for a second. Our genes have some tricky mechanisms at work for them to keep themselves in the gene pool. So we have worry and anxiety about the future. So if we worry about the future, we can avoid certain things, and we can survive longer. If we ruminate and we just kind of really worry about the past, and we kind of tease it and we obsess about why we did something wrong, that can prevent us from doing that wrong thing again. So that'll keep us alive a little bit longer. But rumination and worry and anxiety, those things will help us to survive, but they will never help us to thrive. So we are hardwired to remember the negative. And we use all that worry at the expense of the present. At the present moment, you're sitting there in this room listening to this webinar, but nobody is jabbing hot metal spikes under your fingernails. And yet we're not thankful for that. I doubt anyone sitting in Mexico or there in Houston right now has a toothache right now. But if you had a toothache, it would be all you can think about. So Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, often says we are rarely thankful for the non-toothache. So think about just for a moment what a relief it is that no one is breaking your finger. So the present is actually relatively benign, but we fill it up with negative thoughts about the future and about the past, and this is part of what brings us down into burnout and into depression. But there's a way that you can short-circuit that. That's the point. We can short-circuit that if we use 3 good things, and this is going to help with our sleep quality as well. 3 good things is not the Dr. Seuss 3 good things. In fact, these are my 4 good things. It's my son Parker, who's 10, and Simon, who's 7, and Cassidy, who's 4, and Tatum, who just turned 2 last week. That's my gratuitous family photo shot. 3 good things is really about what we can do to utilize sleep in a way that will short-circuit our tendency to focus on the negative. Our memories are tricky. Good memories are like Teflon, and they slip away. Bad memories are like Velcro or static cling socks, and they just stick to us. They especially stick to us when you're tired. 3 Good Things is a tool that retrains your brain so that you can remember the good things and your role in bringing those good things about. So if we look at this from the validation study, this is Marty Seligman. He was the president of the American Psychological Association for almost 10 years. He's a brilliant psychologist and an excellent researcher. And he devised 3 Good Things to basically say, at the end of your day, after dinner, but before your head hits the pillow, within 2 hours of sleep onset, that's the important thing. If you're one of these people that goes to bed at 9:30, well, first of all, we hate you. And second of all, then for you it's between 7:30 and 9:30 that you should do 3 Good Things. But most of us are going to bed a little bit later than that. So technically between 10 and 12 p.m. or your last 2 hours of wakefulness is when you should do 3 Good Things, preferably right before your head hits the pillow. You just say, what are 3 things that went well today, and what was my role in bringing them about? And that way, right before you go into sleep, right, you're preloading your prefrontal cortex for those positive patterns and positive things that happened during that day, and you actually are thinking about them, and you're feeding off of that when you go into your REM sleep. In fact, it is significantly associated with better mood, better sleep quality. If your spouse snoring wakes you up, you're able to get back to sleep more quickly. If you have to go pee in the middle of the night, you fall back asleep more quickly. Have you ever had a really good dream and you're desperately trying to fall back asleep to get back into that dream? That's what happens when you do 3 Good Things before you fall asleep. It helps your kids. If your kids have night terrors at night, or they're having nightmares, do 3 Good Things with them before they go to bed. It will help to keep them in bed. So you didn't think you'd get parenting tips in this webinar, but a lot of this stuff kind of flows together. Now, the way 3 Good Things works, and I'll give you this example, is if you do this every night for 2 weeks, the effects are not significantly different from Prozac. In the original study that Seligman did, published in 2005, using randomized clinical trial, they actually showed that doing it for 1 week had these effects that were not significantly different from Prozac. So at 6 months out, after doing it for just 1 week, their happiness scores were significantly higher, their depression symptoms were significantly lower, and all of this through 3 Good Things. I'll put up some example 3 Good Things. You can see how we grouped them under the pillars that we cover in our resilience work that Jochen and I are involved with: self-awareness, mindfulness, sense of purpose and meaning, our self-care, and our relationships. Those are some examples of 3 Good Things from study participants. What we're asking you to do is just to think to yourself, what are 3 things that happened today that went well? And what was my role in bringing those good things about? That's all you have to do. The closer you do it to bedtime, the better. The way it looks here, let me show you. The way it looks here is the exercise works if you get to reflect on the positive and your role bringing it about. Important to say what went well and why. It's been called the 3 blessings exercise. It's been called the 3 Good Things exercise. It's been called the what went well and why exercise. All of them, you can Google it and YouTube it under all of those. You have to do it 14 days to get the maximum benefit. You can stop then, or you can continue. Many people, once you do it for 2 weeks, have no problem doing it kind of ad nauseum. Beyond that, if you ever stop at the end of a day with a spouse or a loved one to say, what was your high point and low point today? Just stop doing that and say, what are 3 things that went well today and why? That's all you have to do. The best time is right before sleep onset. If you're going to share it with others or talk to others about it, especially if others in your NICU are doing it, say, hey, did you do your 3 good things? Or something goes well for them, and you say, hey, that could be one of your 3 good things. You can reinforce this and give this some good PR in your unit. Remember to, whenever possible, use those resilience pillars in your 3 good things about relationships or self-care or self-awareness. Those are great prompts for 3 good things. And beware of transitions. You might ask yourself, why don't more people do this if this is just like Prozac? Because it's hard to do it all for an entire week. Many people would do it once or twice and then they stop. And where it's most difficult is when you transition from weekdays to weekends and from weekends to weekdays. So Friday to Saturday transitions are really bad, and Sunday to Monday people just stop doing it and then they don't go back. So it's really, you have to form a habit, and to do it for 2 full weeks is incredible. You do it the first time, it's pretty straightforward. Once you've done it 5 times, you think, wow, I'm getting good at this. And you start noticing during your day things that you might count that evening in your log of 3 good things. It's important that you support each other other when you're doing it, that you take this seriously. This is a powerful psychological intervention. If you let it be, it can help you tremendously. In fact, by taking the 50 most severe subjects in their study, Seligman showed that you can go from your happiness, a kind of percentile. Your happiness goes from the 15th percentile to the 50th, right? You go from really not well to right about average on your happiness just by using 3 good things. There's no pharmacological intervention here whatsoever. The Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale here shows that you go from severe depression to mild or moderate depression just by doing 3 good things. This is as powerful and in many cases more powerful than Prozac because SSRIs, as you know, work really well for severe depression, but most of us don't have severe depression. They're severe depressives, they can't drive a car, they can't hold down a job. Most of us have mild to moderate depression, and what we know about SSRIs is that they're not significantly better than placebos. They work really well for severe depressives, but not mild or moderate. 3 good things works for severe, mild, moderate, and non-depressives. That's why we also measure happiness, because we can see that the people who started off without depression, but they were happy, they got even happier through the course of doing 3 good things. Now, with that, I'd just like to leave you with this Dr. Seuss quote: unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. That's from the Lorax. This is about using 3 good things as one tool to move you in the direction, and hopefully your unit in the direction of being able to notice the positive. As Barbara Fredrickson, a psychologist at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, would say, the negative screams at you, but the positive only whispers. So we have to be more tuned into and aware of those positive things. That's what 3 good things does. It short circuits our natural tendency to focus on the negative. This is powerful. Use it on your spouse. Use it on your friends. Share it with people. The more into it, the more evangelical you get about it, the better off it'll be. Please do it for 2 weeks and look at the benefits. And with that, I'd like to hand it back over to you.